welcome back. Today's video is on propagation. It's not about how to propagate because chop a bit off and put it in water. Done. So I've got a list of tips here which I will read. That's not true. There's just some tips that I wish I'd known when I first started propagating plants. So yeah, but I can't remember them. So there's also, oh no. Right, number one is you need to be patient. So propagation, I can't say to you it takes 2 weeks for a monstera cutting to produce roots, because it might take a week for you and 6 months for me, and I don't know why. The reasons are where you live, the plant, the water, the weather, the light, but it almost doesn't matter. And yeah, propagations don't have a 100% success rate. Some plants are easier to propagate than others, but it may take months, and it doesn't mean it's not worked. It just means it's taken its time. As long as the cutting hasn't rotted, it may still be viable. If it looks like a dead husk, then chuck it. But especially things like snake plants, they notoriously take a long time. But what did my Syngonium tri-leaf wonder took literally 6 months to produce roots, and then it went mad. Loads of roots, loads of leaves. I have a philodendron golden dragon which produced roots almost immediately, and now 6 months later we have one new leaf which has yellowed before it's unfurled. So how fast it produces roots doesn't govern how fast the plant's going to grow. It may take ages to produce roots and ages to produce leaves, a few days to produce roots, and then we get new growth immediately, or a combination. There's just no way of governing it. Number two, there are various methods of propagating plants, and if you have one and you don't think it's working, then you can try other stuff. So I learnt this when I was trying to propagate Rhaphidophora tetrasperma. It just wasn't working. I had cuttings and I had them in water. I tried them in soil as well. So I think I took 3 cuttings. I put 1 back in soil, 2 in water. The 1 in soil just died. The 2 in water, they just didn't root. It was taking ages, and I knew they were one of those plants that shouldn't take that long. And as I said before, I could have just waited and they probably would have rooted eventually, but they were starting to rot and I didn't want to get it to the point where there was barely any node left. So I switched them to sphagnum moss, or you could use perlite. Just something to get it out of the water so it won't rot as fast, but still a moist medium. And I found that Rhaphidophora tetrasperma root much quicker in moss than water, and other stuff doesn't. So it can take a while for you to learn what works best in your house. So a few videos ago, I put cuttings in my AeroGarden. 6 of them have done nothing, but my Hoya Bella has gone mad. So many roots, which I don't know what it liked about the AeroGarden. I'm assuming it's the light and the aeration of the water that it prefers. But it's just interesting how some plants don't care and some are like, oh yeah, like this. Leca is also another good one to try. Basically, everybody talks about propagating plants in water, and it just doesn't work great for me because it's too much maintenance. I'm really bad at like leaving them to get all like covered in algae and gross on the windowsill. So for me, other stuff works better. Now I think I root almost exclusively either in my aquarium, my AeroGarden, or in Leca. The benefit of Leca as well is that you have much longer before it rots because the water isn't around the roots. Another method you can do, if you have a plant and you don't want to cut it because you're scared, say you've got like a Rhaphidophora tetrasperma and you're down to like your last 2 leaves and you really don't want to take another cutting, what you can do, now this only works on like, you couldn't do this with a plant that had really like a thick stem, but you can with some. So this is a philodendron micans, and what I do with this is I just use hairpins to pin, there's just little hairpins here, and I just pin the vines back into the soil, and where the nodes have contact with the soil they can start to produce roots. I suppose it's a little bit like air layering, which I've not tried yet because lazy. So yeah, you can just root parts of the stem and then chop it off afterwards, and then you've got less chance of it dying. Tip number 3 is to start with cheaper plants, just because it's not as stressful and you can end up pinning all your hopes on one propagation without realising that little bit of experience of learning what isn't working, what rot looks like, what roots look like, that kind of thing really helps. And if you know you buy an elbow monstera for like 400 quid and then you take a cutting and it's not working, that can be really stressful. So I would really recommend starting with cheaper plants. I know if you spend a fortune on a plant, it can be really tempting to take a cutting straight away and recoup your losses. But if you're not experienced with propagating, and you don't have to have a ton of experience, but just something as simple as knowing what root rot looks like, or like stem rot, can be the difference between a dead cutting and an alive cutting. Tip 4 is to change the water regularly, and this is what I'm really bad at. So I know I explained this before, but I'll just explain it again because it's something that is sort of not talking about. It's something that's not talked about that much. So when you root a plant in water, the roots it grows are water roots. They're not soil roots, which is what a plant in soil has. So water roots can absorb oxygen from water. Soil roots just absorb oxygen from the air, which is why overwatering kills them, because there's no oxygen. So when you change the water, you are adding more oxygen into the water. So oxygen only lasts a certain amount of time. Now, there are things you can do, and this is my 5th tip, to reduce the amount of water changes you have to do. And one of them is like if you add an air stone, it oxygenates the water. And not only does it mean you can leave longer between water changes, it adds extra water in. No, it doesn't. It adds extra oxygen into the water, which can help root faster. And it can help reduce the chances that the cutting will rot. Tip 6 is something I admit I have never ever done, and that is use something sterile to cut the cutting, because you can get all kinds of diseases, past stuff between plants if you don't use sterile equipment. If I'm taking cuttings from something expensive, then I will pour boiling water from the kettle over my scissors, but it is not something I normally do. In fact, I'm known to like just use my fingernail to take cuttings. It's not healthy, but this is like do as I say, not as I do. I've not had any casualties from that, but like from diseases and stuff getting transferred, but I would hate for you to. So yeah. Tip 7 is propagation boxes. Propagation boxes are awesome because you have a controlled environment, and the 3 things that help plants, whether they're dying or you want to grow them or root them or whatever, is light, humidity, warmth. Because they tend to be, especially here in the UK, they tend to be the things we don't have, and they are the things that plants like to have. So if we can increase them, that makes the plants happier. And all you need is a plastic box with some coir on the bottom. You can put your cuttings in there, grow light on top or a windowsill, close the lid, which will keep the humidity in, and you've got a propagation box. And it's surprising how much better they grow. If you don't want to use moss or coir, you can use perlite, or you could even just use like pots with lacquer in, whatever. But you just want a sealed box with a light. You can put a heat mat underneath it, and that will really, really speed up your propagations. Tip 8 is about transferring your rooted cuttings back into soil. Now, I don't do this anymore, but it is, in my experience, the hardest thing about getting new plants. So the roots that grow on the cutting, as I've already mentioned, are water roots, not soil roots. So when you transfer the cutting back into soil, it needs to grow soil roots to be able to absorb oxygen properly from the soil. Now, water roots can absorb some oxygen from the air, but they're not that great at it. So the more roots you have, the better, within reason. If the plant has a ton of roots, it will then start growing more, which means when you transfer it back into soil and some of the roots will die off, you can end up losing leaves. So it's really up to you. I would tend, the sort of rule of thumb is you want like between 1 and 2 inches of root. What I tend to look for is when the first set of roots have a secondary set of roots coming off them, like branching on the roots. That tends to suggest that the roots are doing well. And then you just want to keep the substrate damper than you normally would for a couple of weeks. It is normal for there to be a bit of decline in plants when you're rooting them, when you're switching them from from water into soil. It's sort of inevitable because you're changing the way they work, so they will need extra care. So One thing you can do is make sure that when you're transferring them over, you're not doing it when you're really, really busy, which sounds stupid, but it can really be the sort of difference between a cutting that makes it and one that doesn't. Put them somewhere where you see them a lot, and just make sure that you're keeping them damper than you normally would. You could even try putting them in a clear pot so you can see the roots more. You know, a really airy mix and a clear pot, just so you can see what's going on with the roots. But yeah, if I'm going to lose a plant, that tends to be the time that I'm going to do it, just because I don't tend to keep a close eye on anything. Tip 9 is about propagation vessels. You can buy propagation, what are they called? Just like those little propagation kits. They're normally like those little glass flasks with like a little wooden stand, and they look really cute. But you don't need those. The best thing I've found is actually sweet chilli sauce jars. The ones that sort of, I don't have one, but they've got quite a thin neck, sort of tall and thin, and yeah, I've just found that they are the best for making sure the plant doesn't fall into the water. That is the only thing that makes or breaks a propagation vessel, is whether or not the plant can stay upright with the stem in the water and the leaves out. But yeah, sweet chilli sauce jars are the best one. Tip 10 is don't get defeated when people have more success than you. It took me ages to get into the propagation groove. Everything just kept dying, and I don't think I even did anything particularly different. It was almost just like the more I did it, the better I got at it without... It's a little bit, if anybody here is a barista, when you first start doing latte art, you can learn how to make the best milk and you sort of learn how to make the patterns, but it's really just, it's practice, and then all of a sudden it just happens, and it doesn't feel like you've done anything differently. You know, you've been getting the pattern right and the milk's been perfect, but it's just not been working, and then all of a sudden it does. It's almost like somebody's watching you going, right, she's done it 100 times, she'll be good at it now, rather than you actually having done anything. And it is practice, and there will be subtle changes that you're making, but it doesn't feel like that. It just feels like all of a sudden you're better at it than you were. Also, you don't need to propagate stuff. I got into this weird phase, maybe about 5 months after I really got into plants, where I would take so many cuttings for no reason. Like I had a Pelia peperomoides. Is that how you? I don't know how to say that. And every time it had a pup, I would take it out and pot it up. What am I going to do with all these plants? Now I tend to leave stuff on. I only propagate either... The main reasons I propagate now are if people ask for cutting, if they ask for a cutting, I tend to propagate, I tend to root it first. Or if I'm just, experimenting, seeing if something works just for my website. But you don't need to do it. It's not like, you can let your plants get big if you want. And also, if you want to prune your plant, you can just chuck it away. I would personally, like, if I'm pruning my plant and I don't want to propagate the cuttings, I just leave them out on my front wall. So if people are walking past, they can take them. But I don't do that very often. But yeah, don't feel like you have to propagate every single, succulent leaf that falls off. Because if you have a burrow's tail, you'd never stop. One last thing on rooting hormone. Now, I don't use rooting hormone because you're supposed to use it on, like, dry... Basically, if you get it wet, it falls off because it's powder. So it doesn't work brilliantly in water. But there are other plants that produce... Typically, the faster a plant grows, the more rooting hormone it produces. Because plants naturally produce rooting hormones. You're just speeding it up. So pothos are well known for producing a lot of rooting hormones. So to increase the chances that your cutting will root, you can put a pothos cutting in with it. Another alternative to pothos is willow. If you have a willow tree, they do the same thing. They grow crazy fast and produce rooting hormones. So yeah, you can do that too. If I'm 100% honest, I've never noticed a difference between a cutting that had a pothos in with it and one that didn't. I will try it when I've got a pothos cutting going. 2 cuttings from the same plant, similar size, same size. A proper scientific experiment, one with pothos in, one without, and I'll see if one roots before the other, but I've never noticed it make a difference because I tried it when I was trying to propagate my Rhiphidophora tetrasperm. I did try it, not at the same time, so I couldn't tell, but it didn't work. Like, it didn't root at all. So in my experience, it's not the surefire thing that it's sort of made out to be. It may help, it may not. I'm just saying, like, don't put all your cuttings in one pothos basket. Yeah, like all plant advice, there will be a million people saying it works and 4 million saying it really doesn't. So it's really just a case of experimenting. I hope that video was useful. Please let me know if you have any tips for propagating, or if you know more about the pothos thing. Is one pothos better at it than another? Who knows? So thanks for watching, and I will see you next week. If you have anything to add, please leave me a comment, and thank you very much for watching. Bye.